Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Jody Foley. I serve as the State Archivist for Montana. And in that position, I'm also designated as the coordinator for the SHRAB, which is the State Historic Records Advisory Board. And every state has a Historic Records Advisory Board. They are funded through grants from the National Archives through something called NHPRC, National Historic Publications and Records Commission. And the idea for all of these groups is to promote archives work, and promote the tools that are out there and promote training, everything archives we try to do. Montana SHRAB specifically does a couple of different things. We do this training every year as part of the history conference. We do Archives Month poster, which should be in your mailboxes, or you've already received it and you have it put up already, I hope. We do something called the Student Archivist and the Blitz, both of which we provide funding for a student, in one case, to come to a repository and work for 10 weeks on any archival project that you have. The Blitz is funding for a week to provide training to get people into your repository and help you with a more finite project. So the training today, this is the second part in our emergency planning and preparedness training. And this is going to be presented by Jerry McGee, who is our Chief of Security here at the Historical Society. We're very excited to hear what he has to say. Lots of good information. And if there aren't any questions, why don't we go ahead and get started? Jerry, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. And please, if you have any questions, submit as we go along, and Jody will make sure I get those questions, or we can wait till the end. But either way, I'm going to bounce all over the place, a lot of information to talk about. Just to give you the heads up, though, I am going to focus on life safety and saving people first and foremost. So last week, Kellen probably talked more about archives, the collection, museum collections, artifacts, preservation, things like that. We're not hitting real heavy on recovery at this point. However, this week we're going to shift focus a little bit more towards simply planning for the preservation of life, quite honestly, and what we can do during an emergency to try to keep our staff, our visitors, our patrons alive and well. Should we have to evacuate, how do we get them out safely and things like that. So we're going to kind of go with that as far as the focus. So bear that in mind, and I will kind of bounce around. This is a huge topic. It's a challenge. I've been here at the Historical Society for about 7 years now, and it's disaster planning is such a big topic. And you'll see a little later in the presentation, I'm going to give you a glimpse of what our disaster plan here at the Historical Society looks like. And you're just going to get real brief snippets from the table of contents, and you'll see how big this plan is in this program. And we can go on and on. We can start talking about disaster and then emergency preparedness, almost a subtopic. And then we can go into safety and the Safety Culture Act and things like that, and how that affects this plan as well. So it's big, it's broad. Don't be intimidated. If you're just getting started in safety with your facility, don't be intimidated. If you start doing something, it's better than nothing. And that's what I found with this plan is terminology can change from, I guess, whoever you're networking with, from maybe at the federal level to the state level to different emergency service managers. Just don't be intimidated. If you're doing something positive, that's great. Something is better than nothing. This is a little dated, but it from back in 2005. I don't have any reason to believe that this has changed. It's kind of a surprise. Nearly 80% of museums in America do not have a good emergency management or disaster recovery plan. And we are talking about museums. And again, just like everything else in our industry, this can be a broad term. What is a museum? Is an archive a museum? Is a storage facility a museum? But we do generally use that broad term museums to talk about libraries and other institutions that deal with collections and historical collections specifically. Also, you look at historical sites, how they're managed, what kind of safety plan they have in place. So it does change, but for the most part, if you're looking at a school, a hospital, a museum, you're all trying to do essentially the same thing. You're looking at the assets that you have, whether that be people, artifacts, whatever, and how can you save that? What can you do to best protect it? And then after a catastrophic incident, quite honestly, how can you recover? We'd like to bring that number down and get more plans in place out there. And something to keep in mind, I don't know what you folks are working with as far as facilities, but some of your resources may be limited, both financially as well as the manpower you're working with. Maybe you're largely working with a volunteer workforce. That's a challenge. Here at the Historical Society, we have the luxury of having a fairly good size employee base, as well as we have a little bit of money, so we can throw some things at some of these plans and do some great things. But a disaster plan does not have to require a lot of money. It's just getting some things on paper, talking about it, doing a little bit of training with your staff. It's really not that complicated. What is emergency planning and preparedness? Emergency planning is the intended response to an unexpected series and dangerous occurrence. Emergency planning may involve preparation and planning for a natural or man-made disaster, accidents, breach of security, terrorism, medical emergencies, food or other essential service chain breakdowns, and other disruptive catastrophes. And this definition came straight out of safeopedia. So I'm going to give you a lot of resources out there, and at the very end, I'll throw these out there as well, along with a website if you want to visit these websites. A lot of great resources out there, and please visit them when you're developing your plan. And again, I can't stress enough, don't become, too unsure of yourself. Just move forward and make some progress. Emergency planning aims to reduce the effect of destruction caused by unexpected situations like accidents, fire, sabotage, spills, explosions, natural disasters, terrorist activities, and medical emergencies. And keep in mind, I will focus largely on fire today. When you look at our institutions, fire is commonly the number one risk that we all face day to day. It may not happen a lot, but if you have a fire within your facility, it can cause fatalities, it can cause total destruction. And when we start talking about recovery, there may not be a recovery effort after a significant fire. And we'll talk in just a few slides about a few of these fires that we've seen recently. It shows the preventive actions, preparation to meet adverse situations, how to mitigate, and how to have a positive control during the situation to save lives and reduce property damage. I underline save lives because that's really our focus here today. And if you save lives, if you put things in place, whether it be systems such as a good fire alarm system, good fire suppression system, things like that, plus you put plans in place that will help to save lives, it indirectly will help to save your collection as well. So preventative actions, preparation, and mitigation. And when we talk about these things, this is a plan you don't just want to put into a binder and stick on the shelf. You want to revisit it every once in a while. You want to train with your personnel. It needs to be shared with your staff so everybody's familiar with what the plan is. Why do we do this? Back in 2018, I'm sure you all remember, the Brazil National Museum had a catastrophic fire incident. At this time, they're looking at $60 million simply to rebuild the structure. I think that's conservative. The objects lost are from thousands to millions, and truly the millions of dollars lost are probably hundreds of millions. The cost of fighting this fire, it goes on and on. Huge loss, and if nothing else, the loss of Brazilian history is hugely significant to their national treasures. One thing I do want to point out time and time again, you look at this fire, and as far as I know to date, there were no casualties. So what can be said about the life safety aspect of it? Maybe some good things were done, and we fail to recognize that. After a big catastrophic fire like this, if nobody lost their life, that may be a win. The Notre Dame Cathedral fire back in 2019, repair estimates anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion. Again, no casualties. So huge fire that could have been cost many, many lives. It didn't, luckily. What could we have done to prevent this fire? I don't know. Could there have been some better systems in place? Maybe. But you do look at the plan that they had in place as far as life safety and things like that. They did have something, and the win at the end of the day was no casualties. And just recently, this last year, the Museum of Chinese in America, their archives burned. I believe this is located generally in the New York City area. Unknown dollar loss at this time, unknown loss to archives, but they're talking at least thousands of items. And the last I saw was about a $3 million donation coming in to help rebuild and try to recover what was lost. Again, I know there were some injuries during the firefighting effort, but to date, I'm not aware of any casualties. So we got to look at the win and what we did well and not necessarily what we did poorly, but we can go back, readdress, revisit this and say, what could we do differently next time? Why did we have a fire? How can we fight this fire? And systems in place. What could we do differently? And that's part of this risk management that we're going to get to. The disaster plan includes preparedness and response plans for all relevant emergencies and threats, natural, mechanical, biological, and human. Addresses the need of staff, visitors, structure, and collections. Specifies how to protect, evacuate, and recover collections in the event of a disaster. Includes evacuation routes and assembly areas for people. Assigns individual responsibilities for implementation during emergencies. Lists contact information for relevant emergency and recovery services, includes floor plans, bears date of last revision. So it does go on and on and on. And again, it sounds intimidating, but this is a plan you can develop over not days, weeks, even months, but this may take years to develop a good disaster plan. You're constantly revisiting, you're constantly bringing about revisions, you're changing information, facilities can change, personnel can change, in-house training can change. So you constantly need to revisit and continue to add to the plan. Phases of disaster management cycle provided by FEMA. A simple way to look at it, we have this circular graph. Before the incident, we have mitigation and preparation. So mitigation, again, we're talking about largely about systems that we're going to put in place. We're going to do some risk management, identify what we're trying to protect, some of the vulnerabilities, and what we can do to minimize the effects should we have some type of a disaster. The preparation, we're going to take actions ahead of time to be ready for the emergency. And specifically to life safety, we're talking about fire drills, earthquake drills, things like that. Maybe some of you just recently participated in the Great Montana Shakeout earlier this month. An earthquake drill, primarily we focused on what are we going to do with our staff? What are we going to preach to them? Drop, cover, hold on, protect themselves from injury, and how we're going to get them out of the building so we can do an accountability piece, make sure our folks are accounted for and safe. Then we're going to move into the latter phases and ultimately recovery. But at this point, as far as my purposes in that drill, it's life safety. During the incident, we're going to talk about response, protect life and property during the emergency. And finally, we talk about recovery and how do we rebuild. And then we start it all over. We go back to mitigation. We go back to risk management. We start to recognize our assets. How are we going to protect? Oftentimes emergencies or catastrophic events are what really kind of spearhead this movement when we start to ask questions as far as why did this happen? How did this happen? How did people die? Why did they die? What can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? And a really good resource, I'd really encourage you all to visit the American Alliance of Museums. Great disaster plan out there, great quasi template with some real detail to it to really tell you what's going on and how to start developing your plan. I wasn't here initially when we developed our plan in-house, but I believe probably some of the authors, and it was by committee, but I'm going to guess the authors used resources from the American Alliance of Museums to really start to develop and build that plan. You have your introduction. That can be as brief for detailed as you like. Then you really get into the meat and body of the plan. The emergency preparedness and preventive piece, part 2, that's what we're going to talk about today. The response procedures, part 3. 4, emergency cleanup and salvage procedure. And finally, institution-specific information. That's where you get into phone numbers, contact information for resources, specialized training, equipment, and maybe supplies you have for an emergency. You don't want to be thinking about the recovery piece at the time of recovery. You want to be able to just pull the 3-ring binder off the shelf, flip open to all your contact information, and if I need a certain product, there's the name of the company, there's my resource, there's a phone number, I make a call, I got my supplies just like that, if you don't already have them in-house. The MHS disaster plan, like I said, I just basically got our table of contents. I'm not going to go into detail, but you'll see a brief introduction, and it's broke down into really any type of a general introduction into a document such as this. General information, distribution of the plan, how to use the plan, review and updating the plan, and most importantly, scope and goals of the plan. You got to come up with some type of a mission statement for your disaster plan and the goals, what you're trying to accomplish. Somewhere in that plan, in that introduction, I would really strongly encourage you to throw something like this. This is straight out of our plan. It's the disaster plan. Primary goal is to minimize or eliminate damage to our collections after first ensuring the safety of staff and the public. Again, I highlighted that. That has to be the first focus, ensuring the safety of the staff and public. And in so doing, that will help to protect your collection as well. The response to the plan, part 2, we got evacuation procedures. We got emergency numbers for services as well as maintenance and utilities. You can't forget about all these other services that you receive almost on a daily basis. If you have a good network built with these folks in a time of need, maybe you're just pulling contacts straight out of your cell phone and you're making calls at the time of the incident, and you're already starting to plan your recovery piece. So you think about this beforehand, you plan for this emergency, you plan for the worst. Of course, you hope it never happens, but you gotta have this type of plan in place. You don't wanna be scrambling through this post-incident when you have so much more going on. Emergency call lists for your staff, largely. Key personnel, contact information, a disaster response team in-house probably, or maybe not. Some of you may be in smaller communities. Your disaster response team may be community members. Reach out, see what other experts you have within your community that can help you out day to day. Reach out to your volunteer workforce. Maybe you'd be surprised who's in there. You have a former retired firefighter that can provide you some really good information as far as planning your response. Advanced warning emergency preparations, and we're going into things like severe thunderstorms and winter storms and wildfires, forest fires, things like that, and tornadoes. I provide that information in-house for us, more informational purposes only. Luckily, we haven't had a huge significant incident. As Jody mentioned earlier, we just got dumped on. We got a whole lot of snow. I'm already trying to run things through my head when we have winter weather like that. So where does my mind go? I start to think about our structure, our roof on this structure in particular, where our collections are stored. Is there some vulnerabilities? We're talking a huge membrane, a single membrane type of a structure on this roof. Could it have become ripped or torn somehow during the storm? Could we be looking at significant leaks and things like that? So during these storms, that's where I start to think, and that's part of, is it life safety concerns? Maybe, but I also send out safety information as far as warning employees about travel and things like that. Taking care of yourself, taking care of your staff and your personnel. Advanced warning emergency preparations. So we're still into response. We're talking about the different weather conditions. I highlighted emergency instructions. That is one bold highlight I used as well. I hope you really like that. It's waking me Emergency instructions, water damage. What if you have minor water damage? Fire, mold, earthquake. And this is not necessarily recovery. This is early in the plan, so it can make reference to recovery, but really emergency instructions at the time of the incident. The severe weather, as far as what we talked about before, hazardous materials incident, power outages. We've had a lot of those lately, and what are we going to do? What are we thinking about? This time of year, you have a power outage. What might be your concerns? How about your building freezing? Can you accommodate a building freeze? Are some of your collections going to be in jeopardy? What can you do? Do you have a backup generator? That's going to be part of that pre-planning. Do you have a plan in place? What if it's long-term? What if we have a catastrophic incident in the middle of February and it's 20 below zero? Do you have possible generators you can rely on to back up systems? That depends on your building and what you have. But if you have networking beforehand, you at least may have some answers at the time of the incident. A sewer system backup, terrorist attack, bomb threats, things like that. Into salvage priorities, initial response steps, notify appropriate personnel, assess the damage, prepare for recovery of the collection, stabilize the building and environment. Do you have a plan in place to do that? Maybe it's in the middle of summer and it's 110 degrees outside. Is significant heat in your structure more of a concern to your collections than necessarily freezing conditions? If you have freezing conditions though, do you have the potential for broken water pipes? Then you have a flood. Now you have water damage materials that may be frozen. That's the way you have to start thinking. How are we going to recover from this? What are we going to do? How are we going to best protect the collection? And then some communications with the media and the public. It's nice to have that in a plan. You don't want anybody and everybody going out there to give some type of a statement to the press as far as what's going on or what's not going on. I'm paranoid. I think about it from a security perspective. I don't want information like somebody to accidentally say, geez, all of our alarm systems are now down. I don't really want the press to go out there and run with that one and say our building is now at risk due to theft because all the alarm systems at the Historical Society are no longer functional. You know, most people, common sense is going to tell you don't make such a statement, but sometimes you make an accident. So we want some good statements that have been edited and ultimately released by your administrator or his or her designee. The recovery bit, onto general salvage procedures. Really some of the details, you know, Jody can speak far better about this as far as her collection with our museum program. Some of their needs for salvage procedures are vastly different. We're talking about maybe leather goods versus firearms, things like that. It varies from item to item, what's at risk, what's not at risk. And then you're going to prioritize how you're going to salvage, what you're going to do. You're going to work in teams. Certain folks are going to have far more expertise in any one area. And then you got to break it down and you got to kind of have this game plan before it happens, because when you're scrambling afterwards, it can be a mess. Still into recovery, just some of the items we're talking about within our facility, microfilm, film negatives, organic materials paintings, whether it be an oil painting or a watercolor. Is it glazed or not? Is it somehow further protected? Photographs, posters, scrapbooks, textiles, are they treated differently? How about videotapes? So for our collection, it goes on and on and on, and each one of these different types of art or artifacts are treated differently, and we rely on this plan to tell you how to recover, how to best treat this to provide its best means to recover. And finally, rehabilitation of the collections is the process of returning it back to a usable state once they have been salvaged. And really this is leaning you towards the direction of being back into the norm, going back into kind of a normal state for your facility. The appendix at the very end, what you might throw in there. Do you ever think about your utility shutoffs? Should you have to shut down your power? Today we just had a power outage during construction of the new Heritage Center. I took the electrician down to our main utility shutoff so they could shut that down during the construction temporarily. Do you know where that's at? Can you shut that down if you should need to do so? Can you shut down your HVAC units and air handlers should you need to do so? Do you know where they are at? Do you know where your hot water source is? Do you know where your risers are for your sprinkler system? Do you understand your sprinkler system, your suppression system, how it works? Do you understand your fire protection systems, security within the building? And these all, somebody kind of has to have this general knowledge, but you also want to be able to go to a place such as a disaster plan. So this information is in writing somewhere documented, so you can share this with maybe emergency responders. If they show up here in a bit, we'll have floor plans. Emergency responders may want floor plans for your structure so they can determine how best to fight a structure fire. Things like that. That goes into your plan at the end of the document. Building access, climate control systems, disaster team responsibilities, in-house supplies. What do you got? Do you have a basic disaster supply kit? Do you have additional supplies? External suppliers and services, freezing services, a big one. Building recovery, collection, salvage services, and it goes on and on. Record keeping forms. Do you have the proper documentation ready to go? Keep in mind, if you have an earthquake, a fire, something huge and catastrophic within your building, you're probably going to evacuate and realistically not go back into that building. Where is all this type of documentation kept? Is it literally in a 3-ring binder on somebody's shelf inside the building where nobody has access? Or do you have access remotely? Is there another document or documents available at annex type sites located throughout your community? Or in this day and age with the electronics and with computers, maybe you have a file located that you can get to electronically offsite. Keep in mind, if your data center, whatever you want to call it, is in-house, it may no longer be available. Can you get to your network from outside of the facility? You got to start thinking about that, because realistically, if an incident happens after hours, bear with me, I got to turn on the lights. Forgot about that. We're on motion sensors here. So keep that in mind. If an incident like this occurs and you're offsite, you have the means to access this type of information. In this day and age with even phone technology, a lot of this stuff you can put on your phone and make it easily available, at least briefly. Maybe not the entire document and everything you got, but maybe different persons have different information that you can share. Do keep the idea of confidentiality and things like that. Some of this information you, of course, don't want just anybody and everybody getting their hands on. So you want to protect the information, but you do have to make it accessible so you can use it in a time of need. Salvage priorities, institutional records, collections by department, collections overall. You don't want to forget about your payroll, things like that. There's some administrative things that are outside of your general museum and archives type of needs, but that's extremely important to make sure people are getting paid. And again, that information is protected. Floor plans, insurance information, again, things in your HR program that you want to make sure you have available. We have some luxuries here where we can reach out to risk management, tort defense, state fund, things like that, Department of Administration, to help us kind of get along. For some of you smaller shops, this may be all in-house. Maybe one person has all this information, and maybe all that information is in one desk inside that facility. You kind of want to get away from that and make sure it's available. Volunteer temporary personnel. We have a huge volunteer workforce here. We try our best to monitor those folks day to day so we know who's inside of our building. Back to life safety, if we have an incident, can I be assured that all of our volunteers have made it safely out of the building? We document that, we track that. Emergency funds, in-house funds, additional funding, disaster recovery contracts, disaster recovery performance specifications, and additional resources for the salvaging specific media. Disaster communication with emergency services. This is part of the networking. You'd want to do this beforehand and kind of understand the response that you're dealing with in your community. Again, I have the luxury of being in a relatively large community We're on a campus with a building owner, General Services, so they provide a lot of the resources for us. We have our large fire department, a police department. We have a quick response. If you're in a rural community and you're a museum, maybe you're relying on volunteer fire departments, which are great departments, but the response time may be a bit longer than if you have a municipal fire response team that will come literally from across town at a given moment's notice in the middle of the night. A volunteer workforce may not be able to provide that. So you need to understand what are you going to get when you call 911 in the middle of the night at 3 in the morning and your building's on fire? How long is it going to take? What kind of resources are going to show up? Local emergency management agencies, keep them in mind. They can also provide some assistance with building this plan. Regional emergency management agencies. Command center, temporary space, what are you working with? Do you have something available? How about the relocation of storage collections? Is there a place you're working with? Maybe you have some type of an MOU in place with another facility close by. Should they have an incident, they're going to use your facility for a relocation, temporary storage, and vice versa. You work out some of those types of arrangements. It works great for both of you. Drying space. On to information technology, I hit on that a little bit earlier. You can't forget about IT and the needs of IT. And finally, alternate access to telecommunications and online services. Prevention and protection, natural, industrial, environmental hazards and risks, building systems, procedures, hazards and risks, preventive maintenance checklists. Does somebody come in and check on your HVAC systems, especially in the winter? What's your preventative maintenance on your boilers, for example? Is there preventative maintenance? Do you have your boiler inspected annually? Maybe it's torn down once a year, rebuilt, checked off, things like that. Again, things you don't necessarily think of until you have a problem, but you want to have things like that in place and document such in your disaster plan. Opening procedures. How do you do that? Again, I have some luxuries here where I have a security force that handles a lot of this for us, and it's a very formal process. It's done every day. Construction and renovation, which we're going through right now, does that change any of these processes, at least temporarily? Staff training, MHS Emergency Action Plan. We'll talk more about this in just a minute. Information technology equipment inventory, and there's the bibliography. So that was a lot. And like I said, just as you can see, just trying to fly through that and talk about our table of contents took a lot of time. And if you went into any more detail about any one of those topics, you can see where this could be a day-long presentation. So I just want to throw a quick example of a museum out there, managing risk, developing a plan. We're not really going to go into managing a risk, but why are we developing a plan? And what is the purpose of the plan? What are we trying to what is the disaster? What are we trying to fix, or what are we trying to mitigate? So here's Jerry's Montana Museum. It's a fancy little facility. It doesn't actually exist, but that's going to be my museum. It does need a coat of paint, but it's going to get better. We're going to look at how to manage the risk within this facility, just to give you an idea of the process of how I would look at what the MHS, our building in, specifically, what are we working with? What are some of our assets, our threats, our vulnerabilities, and how we're going to fix that and address that. So I'm going to pick in Jerry's museum, the number one asset that we all have is the people, whether it be the staff, volunteers, whomever. The people are the number one asset. Are there threats to that asset? Yes. Fire, earthquakes, assaults, the list goes on and on. I'm going to run with fire. Fire is a risk to our people, just like it's a risk to our collection. We look at the vulnerabilities, the building material. As you saw, my building is a little bit run down. It may not be state of the art. Electrical wiring is probably old and dated. Electrical wiring is always a risk. Our fire alarm system, or our lack thereof, our fire suppression system, or lack thereof, evacuation routes and egress. Do we clearly have good evacuation routes and egress? Do we meet building code requirements so that we provide such? Well, in this, with some of our older facilities, sometimes you don't have to meet some of these requirements. whether that be good or bad at the time. It may be a financial cost you simply can't afford, but if nothing else, the fire alarm system for life safety purposes has to be installed, has to be tested on an annual basis. You have to ensure that people can get out safely with some type of a warning from a fire alarm system. So we're going to assess these risks. We're going to pick on the fire alarm system. So the building is a multi-level and susceptible to a catastrophic fire, possibly beginning with electrical malfunction due to daisy chaining of power strips. For those of you not familiar with it, the National Fire Agency is really cracking down on the use of daisy chaining and power strips and the abuse of extension cords and things like that. They're not permanent electrical wiring. They want everybody to get away from that. And daisy chaining is a huge no-no, where you take 2 or 3 or 4 power strips, you plug one into another, into another, into another. It gives you that many more outlets coming off the same electrical source. It's bad. It can cause these devices to overheat and ultimately cause a fire. If a fire should occur, fire would quickly spread in the wooden structure that lacks a fire suppression system. Notification to occupants will be delayed due to the absence of a fire alarm. Potential for fatalities is considerable due to limited points of egress. How can people get out? These older structures don't oftentimes have true egress points, especially up on these upper levels of some of these older buildings. Loss could be catastrophic. So what do? Well, there's lots of countermeasures we can take. Probably the best, of course, and what should happen is the installation of a building fire suppression system and a building alarming system. Both of those. The suppression system, where we're going to put water on the fire, is kind of hit and miss. Some buildings have it, some don't. The day will come when all buildings will have that. Maybe your facility, you've discouraged a water-based suppression system because you don't want to drench a bunch of books. Well, paper can be salvaged when it's soaking wet. It's not ideal, but keep in mind also the type of suppression system you might install. Most of these are pre-action in this day and age. You don't have a total flood of the entire building. You have isolated release of water through different sprinkler systems based on where the fire actually occurs. So it's not a total loss as far as water damage. So still, we're back to life safety. Dumping water in a fire is a good idea. It may put the fire out and it may save lives. But we're going to focus on eliminating the daisy chaining. That was the source. That was the root cause of our fire, was daisy chaining. So we're going to eliminate that. How do we do that? We put it into a plan. So is it part of your disaster plan? No, not necessarily. Is it part of your emergency management plan? No, not necessarily. But part 3, you're going to start looking at a safety plan. And that safety plan, based on you can go to the state's website. I can provide it as well, but there are certain things you should be providing as far as a safety plan, and things like eliminating daisy chaining. You're going to do inspections of the building and things like that. So you're going to avoid the potential for a fire because you're not doing the daisy chaining. You're discouraging the use of extension cords and things like that. So a lot of that's based on this safety plan, which is, again, kind of sort of part of the disaster plan. You're going to hear a lot of different terms, but it all kind of relates to that life safety bit. And just to show you a daisy chaining, so an example on the left, what happened on the right, or the potential for what could happen because of the additional heat that you're putting on that device. So the emergency plan. So we went from disaster, we jumped over a little bit to the safety, and now we're going to go to the emergency plan. Lots of terminology. What is in your building's emergency plan? The purpose of the emergency plan here at the Historical Society, straight out of our plan, it provides a safe working environment for all employees, visitors, and customers. This organization is committed to establishing an effective EAP. The operational aspects of the plan are based on part of the incident command system. Kellen hit on that a bit last week, which consists of employees that respond to any workplace emergency within their scope of training. It provides for overall command and control of the emergency incident, as well as improving communication between the beat, the building emergency action team, and responders. It provides appropriate response actions and assistance during the time it takes for emergency responders to arrive. We work with general services as well on this plan. I wouldn't get too caught up in the incident command system. It's a great resource. Familiarize yourself with it. How much into the weeds do you need to really get to become comfortable with the ICS? Probably not necessary, but you probably will have somebody within your building during some type of disaster that will be part of the ICS and will ultimately answer to maybe the operational piece of the incident command system. But does your entire building need to be familiar with ICS and have formalized training? No, I don't think so. OSHA's requirements in accordance with the CFR require the state of Montana to have a written emergency action plan. This addresses emergencies may reasonably occur at our facility. The AP has been developed through a cooperative effort with General Services, our building owner of the Montana Department of Administration, and local emergency response agencies. The AP communicates to employees policies and procedures to follow in emergencies. This written plan is available on request to employees, their designated representatives, and any regulatory officials who ask for it. So I'm going to open this. It's a little cumbersome, but bear with me. I hope it pops up. Jody, did the EAP pop up there?
It sure did.
And I'm just going to maximize the screen here.
Oh, I'm sorry. It looks like just the slide came up.
Okay.
Apologies. You try it again?
I think I'm going to need to do a new share. I don't know why it does this to me, but.
There you go. It's up now.
Yeah, thank you. So our plan has been around for quite a while. It was really revised in 2016. Every year you should take a look at your plan and make some fixes, make some amendments, make some changes. I do actually, it's not a true revision, but my document includes our sweepers, and you'll see what those are in just a minute. And I update that at least probably several times a year because our personnel change. So do our volunteers. I just read the purpose. We're going to skip past the administrative duties. A lot of this is really, it's a lengthy document. We just don't have time to go word for word. The Historical Society Director supports this plan. That's basically what we're saying here. And here's what we do. This is the type of training we provide in the plan in place that we have for these different types of emergencies. We have an emergency action team. They provide assistance during an emergency. Largely, these are sweepers, which means they help as they exit the building during an emergency. So fire, for example, the fire alarm goes off, people start to evacuate. Our emergency action team will assist with this evacuation, providing whatever needs to staff, to volunteers, to visitors during the evacuation process. We also have some additional training as far as CPR, first aid, and the AED and things like that. So these folks can provide some real basic medical needs at our assembly location in case somebody should be hurt. Here's some of their responsibilities of these beat members. Had to add this one that's highlighted here recently because of all the power outages. So our sweepers will assist security with different needs in the building during a power outage. Oddly enough, the power outage, I'm not so much concerned about life safety, but I do have to worry about the collections and the security of the building. So my needs and my objectives kind of change during that type of incident. I certainly won't call it a disaster, and we kind of get used to it around here. Again, I'm not going to read all of our definitions and things. Talks about the coordinator, which is myself. The assistant coordinator is presently vacant. Incident duties, and don't be intimidated. This was kind of a boilerplate that we took from really working with General Services. All the agencies shared this and just made it specific to their departments. So this is not something, you look at page 6 of 39, that's intimidating. This is just one part of a disaster plan. Take another plan, find one you like out there. As long as you have permission of the owner of that document, take out the name of the business, put yourself in there, change the applicable information and use it. But do talk about it, do train with it. do tabletops, do things like that with your staff so everybody's familiar with the plan and what you're going to do. We just had the earthquake drill, like I mentioned this month. Our staff dropped, covered, and held on. We preached that leading up to the drill, and then we actually had a live drill where folks did actually evacuate the building, and we treated it just like the real thing. We're practicing just in case. We do a fire drill as well every year. You can do as many of these as you want, but you really should think about doing 2 of these drills and exercises at least with your staff, probably twice a year, along with tabletops. Talk about it.
Jared, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes, you bet.
I'm just thinking, this is a really great document. It might be helpful for folks. Is there a way that we could get them a copy of it, taking out all of the personal information?
Yes.
Okay, so anyone who wants that, please just let us know in the chat and we can get a copy to you.
And you can see there are some blanks on here because I did a little bit of that beforehand, but I would probably do a little bit more if we're going to provide the document to folks out there viewing. We have all these different sweeper positions are assigned to different staff personnel just to protect their privacy, I guess, for lack of a better word. I took their names out for the purposes of this presentation. You may not have sweepers within your building. And what I get all the time is with a plan like this is it doesn't work. This employee wasn't there. They didn't sweep their designated area. Well, that's the reality of a disaster. It's going to throw a curveball at you every time. But you come up with a plan like this, more often than not, something's going to work. Yes, some things are not going to work, but there are things that will work. And it is a good idea to come up with this type of a plan, talk about it. And also when you start to do things like this, you do an after action review after your drill or after an actual incident. And you talk about what happened that went well, what happened that didn't go well, what can we fix? Part of risk management. You're going to complete that cycle and you're going to start planning for the next incident. Hopefully it doesn't happen. Maybe you'll come up with something during that discussion that will remedy a future problem so it doesn't happen. Talking about some of the duties and on to the disabled person buddy, if somebody should have a need, for maybe a physical limitation of some sort. Maybe you have an employee, I like to use the example during employee orientation, you broke your leg skiing. So what are you going to do? Is this employee working out of the basement? Do you want somebody with a broken leg on crutches working out of the basement of your facility? No, you'd rather get them up onto the first floor, get them as close to a door as possible, and probably assign them a buddy, somebody to provide some assistance during an emergency to help get them out of the building. That's how you want to start thinking about things like this. You put that plan in place, it reminds you, oh yeah, that's something I need to think about. The alarms in our building, this is just general, talks a little bit about our alarms. It doesn't go into any type of a detail. We have lots of alarms, as you can imagine, intrusion, sensors on our display cases, fire alarms. I mean, it goes on and on. Your buildings may not have these types of options available. Talks about the evacuation, what you're going to do during the evacuation, and this is general, and this is actually part of both the disaster plan. It's reiterated in the emergency plan, and then you'll also find it in guidelines at the end of this document. So we do it, we go over and over and over again with these types of procedures so that we kind of have it down. We throw a little map in there with some of our evacuation and assembly areas, which are going to change. We have 2 locations here on the campus. It's just showing staff where we're going to assemble after an incident. Here's some of our shelter in place locations. They've been removed, but if we have to shelter in place within the building, it's nice to identify, especially if you have extremely large facility. Some of the accountability procedures, we're going to break down by programs, do a head count, make sure we're all accounted for. If you have a fire, for example, and the building's burning, the fire department kind of wants to know, is anybody left inside the building? If you can get to that assembly location and work with the incident commander, probably the fire department, their designee, then you can tell them, we are 100% confident we got everybody out of our building. All staff are accounted for, all visitors are accounted for, all volunteers are accounted for. That's wonderful for firefighting purposes. It also, it would tell them, do we need to take up our risk, try to get into that building to save a life because we know we have somebody trapped downstairs in the basement in the archives. That's good information. Safe relocation area, should we assemble outside and it's 50 below zero, we're going to go someplace else so our staff doesn't freeze to death. Communication procedures. Evacuation of disabled employees. We talked a little bit about that. You have these different kinds of limitations. And I think about this too when you talk about fire alarms and what your system, what your building may have. We have both audible horns within our building as well as strobe lights to indicate fire. So if somebody were to pull a pull station, a fire alarm, or if a fire were to set the alarm off, we're both going to have an audible horn as well as a visible light that's going to strobe and flash to tell people that the fire alarm has gone off. Do you have those types of things available? A lot of us have the audible horn. The strobe light may be an option your building doesn't because of its age. Elevators are not available. We stress that. Fire extinguishers, we got them all over the building. I like to point this out. Part of your safety plan, which would be an extension essentially of your emergency plan, you're going to talk about how do you monitor these fire extinguishers? Do you have somebody in-house check them once a month and sign off on the tag? That is actually a requirement. Do you have a certified inspector check off on those once a year to make sure that they're functional, still charged, things like that? Do you provide any training or instruction with your staff on fire extinguishers, the when, the where, the how? AEDs, we got an automated external defibrillator. Some of you may as well, some may not. You got to have a plan in place. You can't just put it in a cabinet up at your front desk and expect everybody to know how to use it. There has to be training, things like that. You put it in a document, specifies who's trained with it, along with that training, when is it used, under what circumstances, and things like that. Again, I took all the names out, but this is what I update on a regular basis, who within our staff is trained in these different areas, just so I can track that. Some of these are a certification, like first aid, CPR, AED is an actual certification, so I have to track the expiration date to make sure their certification has not expired. Jody, I'm trying to speed up. I know I'm running out of time. Am I okay?
Yeah, let's do a real quick chat. Is everyone okay if we go a few minutes over the, what is it, 2 o'clock hour?
I guess if not, they'll just log out. And
Okay.
my contact information is at the very end of the document here at the end of the presentation. If you want to get hold of me, if there's anything in this presentation you saw that you want to try to use from us and maybe modify, that'd be great.
Looks like everybody's okay.
Okay, good, great. The training, so here's some of the training that we provide in-house within our beat team. And this is an option that you don't have to, put in place within your building, but it is nice, even if it's not a formalized emergency response team, just providing some training such as CPR. Do you provide that type of training to some of your staff? Volunteers, of course. Volunteer staff that wants some CPR training, they can use that on site at home. I always preach the fact that, it's great if everybody in the world had some CPR training, just in case you ever walk by that incident when somebody needs your services, and there you go. It could be a family member, and I've heard of saves like that at home where people were thrilled they got the training here at the department and they didn't have to use it here, but they had to use it at home with a loved one. So something to keep in mind. It's cheap training for CPR. We do an 8-hour block of training for CPR, first aid, AED. Something to think about. Depends on your community. You got to work with the folks that provide the certification within your individual community. We touched real quickly on the incident command system, just throw a little graphic out there just to show folks in-house here where they fall into that. Request for assistance form, if an employee should need assistance, they can actually submit a formalized document. Earthquake guidelines, so I post this during our earthquake drill time and I send it out to staff to remind everybody what to do. And we remember it probably from grade school. You drop under your desk, you cover and you hold on. I think the hold on's a relatively new addition, but the quaking could be significant. And then it talks about the other things you want to do in-house. Suspicious envelope, just another guide to kind of give you an idea if you do get a suspicious package, what you should do with it. Bomb threats and explosion guidelines, what do you do? If you get a called in bomb threat, what kind of information do you collect for responders, for the police? Fire guidelines. What do you do if you hear the fire alarm? What if you don't hear the fire alarm, but you see smoke or fire or flame? Are you empowered to go pull that fire alarm and start the evacuation of your building? Do you talk about that in-house? Does everybody know where they're located? Almost all pull stations meeting current building code requirements should be by your exits. So you should have clearly marked fire exits with the exit sign illuminated above the door, and there should be a fire extinguisher right there in close proximity, as well as a pull station, meaning a fire alarm pull box right by that exit. Again, because some of your buildings are over, you may not have some of these things in place. If you do a remodel, you want to think about it, you may not have any choice. The fire marshal may show up and say, as part of the remodel, you're going to put this in place. Where do you go once you're out of the building? Know your plan, etc. We talk about the fire alarm pull stations. This is part of orientation. When people are hired here, we show them where the pull stations are located and how they work. We got first aid kits located throughout the building, where extinguishers are located. Again, it's both documented so we know where they're at, but we also talk about this plan with new employees to familiarize themselves with where everything is at. A severe weather guide. I always get a kick out of this one during orientation because severe weather in Montana, we don't really have a huge problem with tornadoes. I think the Billings area might a little bit. Here in Helena, not a big deal. But when we talk about severe weather, oftentimes we talk about severe winter weather. Well, here in Montana, you just kind of deal with it, just like we did last week. A lockdown active shooter. Oh, but back to the severe weather. I shouldn't downplay that so much. That's something in-house you can share with your staff, even send out advisories. You have a severe winter weather warning. You can send that out to staff if they're traveling, encourage them maybe not to travel, or make sure that if they do travel, they follow certain precautions, make sure they have a fuel tank of gas, a full tank of gas, and a charged cell phone, maybe throw some kitty litter in the back of their car in case they get stuck, things like that. It's great for you as the employer to protect your employees. And again, part of this plan is throwing that type of safety information out there. Some lockdown procedures to an active shooter, God forbid. Hazardous material or chemical spills, depending on where you're at. And this is a good one to point out. Your risks within your community are kind of unique. I don't know where everybody's at. So if you're next to a river and you're on that river bank and that river is susceptible to flooding every year, then your risk for floods should be part of your plan. Maybe you're going to bump that up higher than fire and earthquakes. Maybe the risk of flooding is going to be your primary concern. So when you start to develop your disaster plan, you're really going to focus on flooding. What can we do to prevent flooding? Can we maybe look at the construction of a levee and things like that around the building and things to consider. So this plan is not a catch-all. It's kind of unique. Our needs in Montana with the super low temperatures we can reach are much different than what they're dealing with in some of the southern climates where they don't have to deal with 20, 30 below zero temperatures. Medical emergencies, good one to talk about. I always throw out the privacy and confidentiality bit, just to remind everybody that that is personal private information. Hostage situation, how do you handle it? And with any of these types of things, if you want to get, again, part of that networking is working with your locals. If you have a good relationship with a local deputy sheriff or a police officer, maybe they're more than willing to come in and talk to your staff and do some presentations on some of this material. Great resource. Same with your local hospital, your local fire department. They love that outreach bit, so they love to come into places and talk about this, and also to come and take a look at your building. It's a great to invite your fire department over and maybe invite them over for some coffee and talk about this. Take them on a tour, show them your building, and maybe they can at least informally assess your structure and tell you what you're working with and some of the concerns they might have. And it's great if they should have a fire that they have kind of some inside information. So in case they show up, they know what the limitations are as far as access to certain areas within the structure. Weapons in the building, some limitations. We have some unique limitations here being on the Capitol campus. And finally, just a form we threw in there for documenting some type of a violent incident. Now I'm going to hopefully exit out of this and go back to Am I back, Jody?
You are?
Good. I know that was a little cumbersome. I don't know why I had so much trouble with that link, but anyway. So that's our emergency action plan. And as Jody pointed out, yeah, we can share this with you. I'll just have to take out some of the information and I can provide you this as far as some type of attachment on email or something like that. There we go. Wouldn't shift. Okay, so finally on to relationship building. I will just kind of go through this real quickly just to conclude the presentation. I know we had mentioned that we want to talk about relationship building, and I think I kind of hit on that throughout the presentation. You want to work with the local folks. You have maybe another sister museum within your community or library or whatever else. Work together, work on your resources, work on some MOUs if you need something formalized. What can you do to provide different resources as far as materials as part of the recovery, or maybe a shelter in place location and vice versa. Things like that are great. And also look at your local fire department. Up here in the upper corner, maybe you got your alarm technician. Do you have a good relationship with your alarm technician? At a given moment's notice, will they show up to help you with some of these services? Your fire alarm goes off, what's going on? Is that a quick phone call for somebody in-house, your facilities person, to make these calls to find out what is going on? What can we do to fix it? So work on these types of relationships. The first and foremost, you have to have good relationship with your building owner. Here on the campus, our buildings are all owned and managed by the Department of Administration. General Services handles the management day-to-day, provide our HVAC services, everything for the building. So we work through them and they provide us with a good functional building, and we have a good communication with them so we can contact them at any given moment's notice as far as our needs. And we have several buildings, including the original governor's mansion as well, that falls under kind of that same relationship. So you want to have a good relationship with that building owner and manager, and make sure that they are, you want them to be following up on your requests and your needs and things like that. Police and fire, build some relationships with them if you can. Our departments here are relatively large, so I'm not going to say every police officer or firefighter in town is familiar with our building and the complete layout of the structure. But still, we have good relationships when they show up. I understand how that works on the inside on their end of it. I know what kind of response I'm going to get under what circumstances. That information is extremely important, so I understand what's going to happen. Anyway, alarm systems contractors. Do you have communication with them as well, or do you just simply put an alarm on the wall and you pay your service contract every year? It has to be a little bit more than that. Fire suppression systems contractor, same thing. Plumber, do you have a plumber at, I guess on a phone call that you can call that's familiar with your building and understands some of the uniqueness of your structure? HVAC technician, extremely important. If you have an HVAC failure, if you have a heating failure with your boiler in the middle of winter, are they going to show up in the middle of the night and take care of you, or is your building going to freeze up? Other museums, libraries, we talked about that. Disaster and emergency service reps within your community. And to follow up on that, keep in mind you got the Montana Disaster and Emergency Services, and here's their website, readyandsafemontana.gov. They talk about community preparedness. That is their thing, is preparedness. That's what they do for a living. So a great resource out there. Do bear in mind, I underline community because they're not necessarily just looking at the Montana Historical Society, for example. They're looking at the entire community and how to protect that entire community during a disaster. but they look at the overall planning, organization, equipment, training, and exercises that they can do or that they will provide as far as networking with the locals and provide a great resource. So keep that in mind. I can't tell you who it would be for any one of your communities, but you go to this website, they will hook you up with the right person for your region. Finally, some of the resources I'd throw out there, probably number one on the list, Museums Association of Montana. Great working partner with us here at the Historical Society. Maybe many of you also work closely, are members of the association. I pulled a lot of my resources straight out of the American Alliance of Museums. Visit that one, probably number one site to check for some of these different things you saw within this presentation. They will provide great resources for you as far as specifically building your disaster recovery plan. Montana DES right there. Safeopedia, they got a lot of great information as well. Visit them. And then the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, right there. There's lots of others out there, but those are just a handful that you may jot down, visit, start gathering some information. I do have to say, once you start visiting all these sites, you start going through disaster, onto emergency management, onto safety programming, things like we have here. It goes on and on and on. Your disaster plan gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a good thing. The more information, the better. Continue, let it grow. But don't just become intimidated and say this has to be done tomorrow. So if you're an administrator, give your staff time. And that time, if you're starting from scratch, can literally be years before this plan is really developed to a point where you're really comfortable that you have everything in place. And then it's a continually evolving document that you're going to continue to build on, maybe take some things out, maybe add a few things. It's ever changing. If I can be of any assistance to anybody out there, answer any of your questions, provide you with some of the resources that I pulled from, please give me a call or send me an email. I'll do what I can. I am not the expert, but I will try to find the one that is if I can't answer your question. And I guess carry forth and please develop those plans and let's get that, let's change that 80% number that you saw earlier in this presentation and let's fix that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. That's just a lot of really great information. We are a little bit over, but if folks have questions, we're more than happy to work with you on those. Also, I did want to put that out there that if folks are interested, we can set up a Q&A in the next couple of weeks that addresses very specific questions. Just let me know. You can either say that in chat or just send it to my email, which is jofoley@mt.gov. And I'll just put that here. I hope this was helpful for everyone. I'm not seeing any questions. Lots of thank yous. We appreciate that very much.
Hopefully that means I answered them all. Perfect.
All right, as I said, go ahead and send any questions, or if you are in fact interested in something, a Q&A, we can certainly do that later. And I guess with that, we'll close out. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and please be safe and careful out there.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.